Hey, I'm Dr. Newman. This is Language, Literature, and Culture. I'm about to teach you about the origins of medieval and Renaissance English theater. I love origin stories. I love unpacking and unraveling the cultural DNA of familiar forms. You may know something about Shakespeare's theater. Maybe you watched Shakespeare in Love. Maybe your high school teacher told you about it when you were doing your unit on Macbeth or Romeo and Juliet or whatever. But we're gonna go a little deep into a little bit of depth about where this explosion of theatrical energy and creativity in the late 1500s came from, because it didn't come entirely out of nowhere. I have a colleague named Dr. Kyle Thomas who has a wonderful channel called the Theater History Professor, where he goes into this in a lot more depth and with more expertise than I do. So if you enjoy this video, check his stuff out. But without further ado, I'm going to just give you an overview of what I think it's important for the English literature student to know if they're going to look at Shakespeare or Marlowe or Johnson and so forth. All right, let's talk about the origins of the English theater. We're going to talk about two separate sources or sets of sources for Shakespeare's theater. One are popular forms of theater, and what I mean by popular forms are those which are not learned or elite. They are kind of authentic sort of folk traditions. They are things that ordinary people do and are not associated with high art or education or any kind of elite practice. These include morality plays, mystery plays, mummers shows, and the Commedia Dell'Arte. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these in turn, and then I'm going to talk about the elite forms of theater that inform Shakespeare's theater, those that are cultivated by an educated and social elite. And those include the classical theater, the Greek and Roman theater, which have been kept alive by scholars and in many cases rediscovered by scholars during the early modern period. This is part of the reasons that period is called by some the Renaissance, because there's this idea that there was a rebirth of classical civilization. I'm a medievalist, so I can't get behind that. But the other elite form is court masques, and these aren't elite so much in terms of education, but in terms of social status. This was a form of theatrical practice that was cultivated by the top echelon of society in terms of money and power, and we'll talk a bit about that too. So let's turn first to morality plays. The first known morality play was written by a woman, Hildegard of Bingen, Saint Hildegard, if you're a Catholic. A play called the Ordo Virtutum, the Order of the Virtues, from 1151. It is an allegory, and an allegory is the main feature of morality plays. What I mean by allegory is that symbols are interacting in a narrative where the way that they interact is itself symbolic. You may be familiar with Orwell's Animal Farm as a kind of like obvious example of allegory. But allegory was a very popular form of storytelling and of psychological and moral thinking during the Middle Ages. One of the main sources of the idea of allegory is a late antique, that is sort of an early Christian epic called the Psychomachia by a poet named Prudentius. And Psychomachia means, psycho is from psyche, meaning mind, and machia is from Greek, and it means war or struggle, right? So Psychomachia is the inner struggle, the inner conflict, and this epic poem, is written in the style of like a Homeric epic with warriors fighting each other, but instead of warriors like Achilles and Hector, it's pride versus humility. It's patience versus anger. And so you have personifications of virtues and vices pairing off against each other. And it teaches how particular virtues are the counters, like Pokemon or something, to particular vices, right? So like the counter to wrath is patience, right? The counter to envy is love, and so on and so forth. Morality plays take this idea of representing moral traits or character ideas or abstract concepts as people and puts them on the stage. Some famous examples from the Middle Ages include Everyman, Mankind, The Castle of Perseverance. In the play Everyman, the protagonist is every man. Get it? get it, represents everybody, every type of person, and they're told they're gonna have to die, and they're like, well, I don't want to die, and so like Death says, well, you don't have to die if you can find somebody who'll come with you, and so he goes around and searches all the things he's attached to in his life, his friends, his family, his wealth, his worldly achievements, and all of the and honors, and all these things are like, no, I'm not going with you. And the only things that will go with him when he dies are like his good works and his faith, and so it's a religious form of instruction meant to teach people religious moral truths. These plays often featured spectacle and fear, with vices painted in like hideous makeup. Often it looks like we might think of it as clown makeup as well. So if you are like frightened of clowns, the theatrical tradition of clown makeup goes back to medieval representations of demons and vices. So maybe there's something to that fear. It's also influenced, some of these plays, by a late medieval idea of the ars moriendi, the idea of dying well. And this connects also to the late medieval motif of memento mori, being mindful of one's death, remembering that your life in this world is temporary. This illustration here from a medieval manuscript represents a story of motif called The Three Living and the Three Dead, where there are three hunters who are young people who are hot and young and rich, who are out having a good time, and then they encounter like these three like zombie dead versions of themselves, and it's a reminder that all worldly goods are temporary. This is one of the main themes of morality plays, and morality plays would have been performed, going back for a second, on temporarily erected scaffolding in town squares during feast days and religious festivals, and they would have been put on by community organizations and support. And this is why they're sometimes called mystery plays. The word mystery does not mean mystery like, who done it, like the Mousetrap or Agatha Christie or something. Mystery was another word for guild. And I'm not going to get into why that is, but a guild would be like the candle makers or the wagon wheel makers or the weavers or something like that. And so each of the different weavers at festival times, like the Feast of Pentecost in the summer or what have you, they would each put on a separate stage and organize and sort of like perform either morality plays or sometimes miracle plays, which were representations of Bible stories. They often featured a theatrical technique known as tableau vivant, where you have a kind of like living painting, a visual representation of a scene, and they often featured singing and hymns. These were amateur productions staged by the community for religious festivals, often sponsored by craft guilds, and they continue to the present day in the form of the Christmas pageant and the Easter Passion play. Both of which are practices in the United States that are still common in the many, many parts of this country with Christian majorities. Is there anything else to say about that? Just that this is another etching showing a representation of a crowd scene gathering around a city square to watch a passion play that is being put on. You can see Christ carrying his cross up to Golgotha there. Another form of popular entertainment, and this was more of a rural one, perhaps were mummers shows. Mummers were folk fest. I don't know much about mummers shows, but they are associated with folk traditions, festivals, and revelry. They're unscripted and they focus on costumes. They often move from place to place, and they survive in modern traditions like trick-or-treating, caroling, and parades like Mardi Gras or the Mummers Parade in Philadelphia. Here is in Britain, St. George, or Spain perhaps, St. George and St. Patrick, in the Isle of Man, are fighting in a mummers play. So these sort of folk traditions of theater also informed Shakespeare's theater. And between scenes and sets, there would often be dumb shows where people in costumes would do dances or play fights or something like that. Another And Commedia dell'Arte actually is somewhere between popular and elite, I'd say. But it comes from Italy, and it was an early form of professional theater originating in 16th century Italy. Uh, it involves basic comic plots that are heavily improvised. So, how it might go depended from performance to performance. It wasn't scripted line by line, but there were stock characters: a know it all doctor, a greedy old man, perfect true lovers, a trickster servant. And the trickster servant was often Harlequin, right? And so that's represented to, that is related to the Shakespearean clown figure as well. And it also is a figure that has its roots in the classical theater, where there's often a wisecracking slave character in Roman and Greek theater. These involved exaggerated acting, pantomime, and bright costumes. And so those are your four kind of popular forms of theater: Commedia dell'arte, mummers plays, mystery plays, and what was the other one? Morality plays. Very good. Let's talk briefly now then about the elite forms of theater. The word theater is itself one that comes from the classical world, from the ancient world, from the Greek theatron, and you can see here pictured an ancient Greek amphitheater, going back at least as far as 600 or 700 years before the Common Era, possibly earlier. The Greeks and put on plays, and of course the most famous plays are the Greek plays of the golden age of Athenian theater. Playwrights such as Sophocles and Aristophanes and Euripides. In Shakespeare time and milieu, the Roman playwrights would have been known better. Seneca and Plautus. In his context, playwrights were studied and performed largely in educational contexts in grammar schools and universities. And Shakespeare himself would have read and translated and even acted out Plautus in the grammar school at Stratford-upon-Avon, even though he himself did not, unlike many of his comrades in the Elizabethan theater and the Jacobean theater, go and study Greek and Latin formally at university, as Kit Marlowe and Ben Jonson did. The ancient theater featured a high style of language for tragedy, more elaborate syntax, a low style, more everyday type speech for comedy, stock characters, simple plots, and minimal settings. The word theater would not have been used by practitioners of morality plays and mummers plays and those things. It was a word that was revived in the 1500s by those who were involved in developing the professional theater, such as Shakespeare and his contemporaries. So the ancient theater was one very important influence on Shakespeare. In fact, one of his first plays, A Comedy of Errors, was based on a play by the Roman playwright Plautus. And those plot tropes of mistaken identities, of forbidding fathers, of wise slaves who wisecrack, as we talked about in Commedia dell'arte, a lot of these come from the ancient theater, as well as the idea of grand speech giving and long soliloquies and the very genres of tragedy and comedy themselves. Both of those are words from Greek that were made well known to in Shakespeare's time by those who had revived classical theater and who were keenly interested in Aristotle's Poetics. Another form of elite entertainment, and again, this is a different kind of elite than the kind of cultural or educational elite that knew Greek and Latin, were court masks. Court masks are really kind of interesting. Here we see reenactors of a Jacobean early 1600 masks. But masks were super popular elite entertainments in Western Europe in the 1500s and the early 1600s. Masked players represented mythological or allegorical figures, and they would dress in these elaborate costumes, and there would be players, kind of professional partiers, who would sort of lead the entertainment, but those aristocrats who took part in masks would be given parts to participate in as well. And so there's a kind of cosplay element to it. Henry VIII supposedly threw an early court mask that was themed around Robin Hood and his merry men. Elizabeth I loved masks. There was one where people represented different heavenly bodies, like constellations and stuff, and zodiac signs. I guess she was an astrology girl. There's also, more problematically, a mask from Elizabeth's court where everybody wore blackface. So that's a whole... There's a whole series of essays about that too. But yeah, court masks were a really popular and interesting form of entertainment that definitely influenced the theater of Shakespeare with their mixture of music, costume, dance, and dramatic verse. So these are the two elite forms of entertainment, ancient theater and court masks, which come together with the popular forms of entertainment. First, during the 1500s, with the wandering troops of actors. You know that scene in Hamlet with the player king and the players are arriving at Elsinore? Well, this idea that you'd have wandering troops of actors going from place to place putting on plays is a representation of the reality of England in the 1500s. And in fact, I think in his sort of somewhat speculative biography of William Shakespeare, Stephen Greenblatt suggests that perhaps Shakespeare left there's like a 2-year gap in Shakespeare's life where we have no records of him between him leaving Stratford-upon-Avon after marrying Anne Hathaway, different Anne Hathaway. Maybe the other one's the different Anne Hathaway. Anyway, 2-year gap between leaving Stratford-upon-Avon and first being registered in a players list in London. So what was he doing? How did he get from Stratford to London? Greenblatt suggests that he left Stratford with a wandering troupe of players and learned the trade of theater while wandering from place to place around England. On the left here, you can see how they would temporarily erect a stage. In fact, they would lay down bags filled with feathers or cotton or wool, and then they would lay boards on top of it to stand up and act out their scenes. And they could do that both in public places, in tavern yards, in town squares, here by a riverbank, or they could set up in a palace court for command performances, as in this imaginary representation here of a Shakespeare play being put on at the command of Queen Elizabeth I, who would not have sullied herself by going and attending the theater herself, even though she loved the theater. So the wandering troops continued during the 1500s, even when, after the Protestant Reformation, mystery plays and morality plays, those old Christian forms of entertainment, were outlawed by the Protestant power coming in, first with Edward VI and then with Elizabeth I, after in the interim with Mary there, which we'll talk about in another video. Those forms of entertainment were considered too Catholic, and therefore they were outlawed. And so theater companies continued, and theatrical performance continued, but it couldn't deal with religious topics anymore. So it dealt with classical topics, such as the Trojan War, or other topics from the ancient world, or medieval history, and all just everyday comedies. Tales were often adopted from comic tales in Italy. Italy was a cultural superpower of the period, which is one of the reasons so many Shakespearean and other plays are set in Italy. Now, what happens when these wandering troops decide that they don't want to wander anymore? They want to set up a place of their own. Well, they go and they build a theater. And the theater is going to be designed based on some of the ideas that they already were implementing as wandering troops, where a raised stage would be in front of a house, as it had been would be in front of a tavern yard when they were wandering troops, and there would be a proscenium stage, I forget what it's called, a jutting stage that goes out into the crowd where people stand around and watch this raised stage. And the Globe Theatre is the most famous one, but there were a number of other ones, including the Rose Theatre, where Christopher Marlowe was. And of course, the Globe Theatre, as people might know, was originally on the north side of London. The theaters had to be built outside of the city limits because it was illegal inside of the city limits of what was then London. So across the river in what's called Southwark, spelled Southwark, it was called a liberty, where it was a kind of where there was freedom from the impositions of social order that were inside the city. And so you had brothels, and you had theaters, and you have animal fighting rings, so like bear baiting and cockfights and stuff like that, which were also in a ring-like structure. So you combine the ring-like structure of blood sports with the stage of the wandering troupes, and you get the Globe Theatre. Here is a picture of the new Globe, which was reconstructed in 1997. I had the privilege of being there this summer of 2024 and went on a tour where the crew was setting up the rather minimal set, which involved putting security fencing around the pillars of a wonderful all-female production of Richard III. So that's pretty much it for this exposition of the origins and development of Elizabethan theater and Jacobean theater as practiced and staged by Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and some other dudes who I don't remember because I'm not a specialist in this period, but I do find it very interesting and I love these works, and I hope you've enjoyed watching. Thank you for listening.